Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horne, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horne, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast. I am absolutely delighted to have in the studio today Dr. Gena Cox. And I want to talk a little bit about her first before she introduces herself, because this incredible resume with an overachiever's career, which is going to really result in something very positive for all of us with her upcoming book. More of that later. But let me tell you about what I know about Gena Cox. And I hope it does some justice to her or some tribute to her. She's an organizational psychologist. She's an executive coach, a speaker. And here's the book I wanted to preview about and tell you about, which we'll talk more about. It's Leading Inclusion. And this is a groundbreaking guidebook for corporate leaders who want to build inclusive organizations from the top down. I can't think of a more relevant topic, a more meaningful topic, a more inspiring topic to drive change and to sustain change and to make for better organizations than the topic of Dr. Gena Cox's book, Leading Inclusion. She has spent a career helping leaders, some in the Fortune 500, build these healthy types of organizations, and she is a noted voice on human-centered leadership. So, Gena, that's a little bit about you. Welcome. Tell the audience about you.
Well, first of all, thank you so very much for having me, Mike. It's really an honor. And that really nice introduction, as they say, sounds like one that I could have paid for because it was so nice. So thank you. I think what people really need to know about me to understand my point of view and how I think is that I didn't grow up in the United States. I am an immigrant. Though I have lived here for 40 years, I was born in England and raised in the Caribbean, and therefore come to the work that I do in American organizations with a particular life experience. The most significant piece of which I think is that having lived in other places, and I do also, have relatives in other places and travel to other places, I am 100% convinced that some of the things that we struggle with in terms of interpersonal relations in corporate life in the United States, we can solve all of these things. I don't think they're as intractable as we sometimes think. And I also think that the other thing that people might want to know about me is that I also look at everything through the lens of motherhood, because I am a parent. I got divorced when my daughter was 1 year old and have not had any more children. But that means that every decision I have made in my career has mostly been prefaced by how is this going to enable me to support this person who is now an adult, by the way, but I still think like a parent.
So is that a mother with optimism or an optimistic mother?
It's both of those things. The book I dedicated to my daughter, and I say something like, in the hope that we can all have a better future workplace and it will benefit everybody. So there's that optimism. And then there's also just the responsibility of knowing as a parent, not just literal parent, but as a person who has brought another human into the world who will be here probably after I'm gone, the desire that that future world be one that is great for everybody.
As you built the book, as you constructed it, as you thought about what you were going to put into leading inclusion, what's the origin story? I mean, you talked about yourself as, being born in England, spending time living in the Caribbean, and then an American for 40 years or so, in the US for 40 years or so. What's the origin story for the book? I mean, beyond those pieces, which I think tell probably a huge portion of the story.
Absolutely. Well, the origin story kind of has two parts. On a personal level, I have spent most of my career in corporate America, and in that career, I have been a fake, a fraud, and a phony, which is something that a famous politician said once that I sort of thought is so, you can't forget that fake, fraud, and phony. So part of the origin story of my book is that I have spent so many years in corporate America where I have not always been authentic. I have been working so hard to fit in, and I have not felt the freedom to be myself. That I wrote this book partially because there's so many things I have always wanted to say to leaders that I thought would be helpful, but didn't think I could say. So now I can say those things in a book. So that's part of the origin story. The other part of the origin story, though, is that I recognized a long time ago that the fundamental challenge that we have with issues of inclusion and of just work, I just think of it more broadly, just employee experience, is that we live in a very segregated society outside of work. And yet we think that magically, when we get into the workplace, we should understand one another when we never see each other once we leave work. And we never talk about the differences, and we never talk about what makes it hard. So the other aspect of this origin story is to remind everybody that there's a reason why sometimes things feel so difficult. But of course, that I believe all of these things can be overcome if we're sort of more aware of that reality.
So, what a great story in terms of also expressing that part of leading inclusion arose from feeling, as in the words of someone else, fake, fraud, and a phony, and perhaps unable to provide the type of insight or guidance or the wisdom which was necessary and which you were capable of giving. So, what's the message around that? What are some of the authentic messages about building the kind of world and building the kinds of organizations that reflect, our best values?
Mm-hmm. So the real obvious literal lesson is that, I am an organizational psychologist. So when I have worked in organizations, I have usually been consulting to my employer's clients and intended to give them the best of my insight from my psychological science perspective. But it's a very data-driven approach when you're an organizational psychologist. And so what I found was that clients were very interested in saying, I want data-driven insights. And we were very good at providing those. But when we would try to color outside the lines and offer insights that were influenced by the data, but also reflected sort of the experiences. So for example, if you're thinking about survey data, which I used a great deal to offer insights to clients about employee experience, clients would love nothing more than to see the quantitative data. Give me some averages. Did we go up? Did we go down? We're good. People loved that. But when I would say, you need to read these comments. You don't need to read everyone literally, but somebody needs to understand what's in these comments, because the gems are in the comments. The gems are not in did we go up by 1 point? It was a little bit harder. So just from a very basic, literal point of view, I say to leaders, the reason I say that I haven't always been able to give the full picture is partially because of this perspective that leaders come at, where it's become fashionable to say we need data. But what most people mean is we want quantitative data. So there's that aspect. The other aspect from a more human, personal level.
I'd just like to comment on that,
Yeah.
Gena, which is to say that, as a organization development leader, I've always have been in part of that spot, which is survey says, having led Great Place to Work campaigns in some organizations that maintain their status on the Great Places to Work list. In many of these Silicon Valley technology, biotechnology businesses, data is king. And yet, I think in some measure, we reached a point where it was survey says. And, forgot the value of the interview and the executive interview. And to your earlier point, to the gems, the nuggets in qualitative data in the surveys. So I just wanted to join in on that comment and I appreciate the context that you bring and honor that as well.
Oh yeah, thank you. And yes, surveys are fantastic. I am a fan of surveys for the record, but only when we utilize the full richness of them. So there's that aspect of that whole thing of fake, fraud, and phony, and the other aspect is on a more personal level, where I like to say, I would show up with my patented poker face when I work with my clients, and yet I would sometimes I personally wasn't having a great experience in my corporate life. But beyond that, there was often my understanding that there were some things that clients didn't even really want me to talk about. So I would attempt to talk about certain things now and find that there was little space for talking about those things. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. So all of the years that I have done this kind of work having to do with employee experience and the measurement of employee opinions and so on, we have observed, and you probably have seen this in your data, that there tends to be a significant difference in the responses of employees to these kinds of surveys as a function of gender, race, ethnicity. If you take race and ethnicity, for example, employees who are Caucasian tend to have higher scores than those who are African American, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander. I'm speaking in generalities. But if you took data over decades and looked at it, you would see that pattern. And yet, that is not a pattern that ever got discussed in a macro level until a few years ago consistently, because again, when you ask about origin story, I know that one of the reasons I wrote this book for senior leaders, I didn't write it for HR professionals, although HR professionals will benefit from it, was because I recognized that they have sort of been operating with a bit of a blind spot on these issues. They did not necessarily know these patterns existed because the data, even if it were cut that way, that data tended to stay in HR. Those demographic cuts were not necessarily part of the core conversation about employee experience. So there's the other aspect of it.
Or perhaps, say, for the annual discussion on diversity, which was often, having accompanied a number of senior executives and corporations on this, a review of representational diversity. Absolutely. Often the annual discussion.
Right. Yeah, and so there's nothing bad about any of the things that we're discussing. I'm not saying those things are bad. I think that it was a way of things being done that was the norm that was not helpful. And I knew that, but I could never figure out how to get past that, because this is a way of doing things that has been sort of encoded into the system for so long. We just do it that way. So I'm just proposing that, we recognize that, in fact, the most important thing that any of us can do, especially if we are advisors to leaders, is to give them more data, give them more insights from the data, all of the insights, don't hold anything back, so that the senior leaders can really understand what's going on here. And when they're making decisions, those decisions can be grounded in a much broader framework than just telling them, engagement is flat, engagement went up, and really letting them see those nuances. And they have got to be receptive to that as well, the executives.
In addition to issues of diversity. What about the topics of equity in organizations, and how does leading inclusion address the topics around justice, equity, justice and equity?
Sure. So first of all, the title is intentionally chosen. It's leading inclusion. It's not leading diversity. And after all these years, one of the things I recognize is that, or that I know, is that there has been a disproportionate focus on representation in terms of trying to address the issues that people broadly call diversity and inclusion. And frankly, I'm starting to counter from 2 years ago, from May of 2020, when there was definitely a significant change in people's I sort of feel like a greater awareness, and certainly a desire perhaps to do things a little bit differently. So
in the post George Ferguson era at that time, is that
post George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, because all of these things happened in the spring of 2020. The conversation changed. So it's, to me, 2 years later. It's not a long time. And while I expect change, I know that I don't expect everything to have happened magically overnight. But with regard to the question of inclusion, diversity, justice, equity, all of those kinds of words, I use the word inclusion to make the point that well, first of all, I say that inclusion tops diversity. Diversity, of course, matters, and you should have a workforce that looks like the available labor force wherever you're operating your business. Okay, that's a given. But I also think it doesn't matter how many people you hire who are, of different races, ethnicities, LGBTQ plus status, disabilities, or what have you, unless you know what kind of an experience they have on a day-to-day basis when they come into the organization. And traditionally, that experience has been negative, meaning there hasn't been one consistent experience for people who come into organizations. And the variation in that experience tends to be along these social lines that we all know and can identify, even if we don't want to talk about them. So inclusion means, the focus on inclusion means that organizational leaders need to not just ask about representation, they need to know about what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And then they need to know what outcomes they should focus on to really measure that. So yes, there are the outcomes you can measure in a survey about how I feel and the day-to-day experiences. That you should definitely do. There are also, though, other outcomes, because I think that people who have been disadvantaged, when they measure the outcomes that they care about, which is why the subtitle is things that you can see and feel, they care about, am I getting, is my pay equitable? Am I being paid the same way, my compensation, I should say, as people to whom I compare myself fairly? Am I getting the promotion opportunities at a pace and of a type that are consistent with what I see others getting around me? The answer is often no. Another one is access to opportunity, which is judged in two ways. Access to the developmental opportunities that could get me ready for the big star thing. That hasn't been equitable. And then literally access to the roles that would put me in these high value roles that generate revenue, roles that have direct face-to-face client contact, the politically powerful role in product design or innovation. Am I getting those jobs, or am I only going to be, relegated to certain kinds of roles? Those are examples of what I mean by that.
Perfect. And you also refer to or describe a respect-first organizational culture. Could you elaborate on that a little more? I think it's fascinating, particularly as we think about how we bring more of who we are to what we do, how we bring our best to situations. It would seem that respect arising out of humanistic values would be so essential in that. And so I'd love to hear you say more about the respect-first culture.
Yeah. So you asked about justice, and I don't usually use the word justice in my framework. And the reason I don't use the word justice is because there are other people who will pursue that particular avenue, because it has a very specific, I think, intention in terms of outcome. Sort of fixing something, making up for something, and all of that. And that's not a word that I think fits for the way for the things I'm thinking about. But I think it's a valid word. But I use respect, and I say respect first. In fact, the acronym that I coined in my book is REDI. REDI, respect, equity, diversity, inclusion. But the R is the more important piece. And it's because I think, first of all, everybody knows what it means. Everybody knows what it feels like. Everybody knows when they receive it, and everybody knows when they don't receive it. In contrast to terminology like belonging, the word belonging has also become popular. I do not use it for two reasons. One of them is that it's very, very hard to define and measure. I don't see any evidence that the people who are meant to be the beneficiaries of this belonging, let's say underrepresented people, could tell you what that meant. Also, belonging is a very strange word to use when you're talking about people who came out of slavery. I don't really want to belong to anything. It's more the respect. But if you ask somebody what respect feels like, and if they're getting it, they don't hesitate. So I like respect. But respect is also...
Seems to me that perhaps just to elaborate on that point, that belonging has a cost, where respect is free of that burden.
Yes, it should be. It should be something that is available to every human just by virtue of being on the planet. The other thing about belonging is who controls belonging. I mean, belonging is something that is basically asking the target to say, I feel like I belong. Whereas respect is something that the environment can provide that, and I can know if the environment provides it or not. It doesn't put the burden on me to say, am I feeling a certain thing? So there are a lot of reasons why I don't use belonging and why I choose to use respect. But also, you know what? I think respect is very easy to do. And it is not mysterious. If I am in an organization, in a group of 5, in a group of 50, we all know what it looks like. And funny thing about it is, we know when it isn't present. So why we don't need more concepts. You know, we need to get back to, like you said, human-centered. This is really what I care about.
That's great. And as you think about this, is this really a series of building blocks, or do you see them with some sort of equivalence when we talk about respect, equity, diversity, and inclusion? How are these related? Of course, they hang together.
Yeah, well, I haven't done that kind of research at this point, and I haven't even attempted to do that kind of research at this point to be able to answer that in the way that you mean it. But it is something that I will eventually do. I think I wanted more something that could be a label that people would remember, because frankly, there is a lot of research. There are a lot of books. There are a lot of people talking about these ideas. They're just sort of misplaced in terms of where they put the focus. So they all matter. I think equity cannot be separated out. You know, we talked just now about, well, how would I measure inclusion and equity? And I gave you some examples very quickly just to help. They're all essential. The diversity is essential. So I think they all matter. So in any one organization, though, I suppose I could always go in and I can tell very quickly, are they focusing on all 4 elements, or are they only focusing on representation? Are they doing anything with equity? And by the way, from a professional perspective, the conversation about compensation and benefits equity has, I think, really risen to the top of the pile, where it wasn't discussed very often in previous years. It's being discussed more. So I don't know which it matters more. I think all of it must be present. And I can also tell you that when only certain elements are present, I can show you, I can talk about the behaviors, you know, that would exist that might not make it work, might not get you the outcomes.
And as you think about these outcomes, I would just assume from a capitalist perspective, they're better organizations that are more productive, more profitable, or meet whatever their stakeholder goals are for that organization, depending on what sector it operates in.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And again, I say so you're getting at what sometimes people call the business case. There is no shortage of academic data. There is no shortage of data coming out of organizations about financial outcome benefits, investment, revenue benefits, profitability benefits, and so on. But ultimately, the issue here, as it is with the conversations about environment and climate and ESG and all of that, because they're all kind of bound together, ultimately, it doesn't matter. What really matters is, what does it feel like to work in your organization every day? And what is your organization doing to the world? In other words, that's the reason I think the ESG conversation is so important. It supersedes the profitability and so on, because we look around and we can see leaders making decisions every day that appear to be contradictory to the survival of the species, but they're profitable, very profitable. And those leaders are lauded for the profitability. And yet, when a week later we see stories where we discover that in this same organization it is so profitable, decisions are being made about people's daily lives, about their working hours, about whether they will be paid fairly, whether they can unionize, that let you know that the human element, which is clearly the thing that gets this all done, isn't being given the same weight as other factors. So if you take a company like PwC, the consulting organization that is led by Tim Ryan, I'll mention them because that is an organization that I admire greatly. I don't just admire the company because of the work that they do. They're very successful as advisors, and they're not perfect. No company is perfect. But when Tim Ryan takes a stand that says, I want all employees to really feel like this is a place where they can be their best, and that they can feel proud of their affiliation with this organization, and they can know that I have their backs. And at the same time, we're going to work hard, make a lot of money, and we're all going to enjoy that. That makes so much more sense to me, right? There's a company called Sodexo that many of us know, but maybe we don't. It's not in our consciousness as clearly as a Walmart or a Target, but Sodexo providing food service and distribution on a global
around
level.
The globe.
In many cafeterias and many, all kinds of places. So we don't all know the name, but we probably have been served by or worked with people from Sodexo. And this is an organization that seems to have figured out we can't separate profitability from the human experience. They have put these two things together. This is all they focus on, both things and environment, by the way. They've been doing that for a very long time, doing it very well. So I like to focus on the ones that I think I admire. The ones that don't do this, I talk about less because I'm not into finger pointing. But I am here to say that there are many examples of organizations that do these things and are still very profitable.
What happens or what gets in the way of leaders and organizations from achieving our aspirations? Certainly, there are all the systemic issues and structural inequalities that are built into organizational life and broader social life. If someone has a desire, what are some of the blocks he or she or they might encounter?
Mm-hmm. Well, because I'm focusing primarily on, this from a governance perspective, I'm thinking about boards and I'm thinking about senior executives and so on. And, I call it the inclusion MBA. You have to have a certain mindset, and then you have to take bold action. And those three, that acronym is very purposefully chosen because what I see getting in the way, or I see, first of all, that some leaders just do not understand the issue well enough to have formed an informed point of view about the issue. Now, so they know marketing, sales, finance, and other things. But when it comes to issues of inclusion, and even again, issues of environmental sustainability and so on, I don't think leaders are as informed as they ought to be. Therefore, their decision-making tends to be not transparent and tentative, and one can see that in their actions. So they've got to understand these issues well enough and then form a mindset that says, you know what, these things really matter. If they don't believe that, they're never going to act. So that's one barrier. Another barrier, though, is the boldness. Because what I have also seen in clients is that a senior team will sit around and talk about diversity and inclusion stuff. But half of the team is just, they're just doing lip service. They're going to slow walk it when they go back to their business units or divisions. They're going to delegate it to people who don't care about it, and they're not going to build in accountability systems. They're never going to circle back to see what do we do and is it working and so on. They're more just saying, okay, the CEO of the board says we should do these, we're going to do it, right? So then the CEO has to be bold enough to say, this is what we will do. This is how we will measure it. And this is how I will hold you accountable if you don't do it. And there might be people on that team that can't stay because it's not that they just don't believe in these things. They're working against the vision. So you get one step forward, two steps back. That's what I see. And then, action. So you can talk about this all day long, but if your only action is you hired a chief diversity officer just to say you hired one, you didn't give them any money, resources, clout, or political power, you can still say you did something. But the action that you took is an ineffectual action that will never generate results. And the CDO would agree with that. They need a certain kind of support. And this is all has to be built into the system. The CDO can't operate alone.
And if you were going to make some observations or some generalizations about where we are today with the state of inclusion work in organizations, whether they're 10-person organizations or 100,000-person plus organizations, different challenges, different dynamics. Where are we on the progress journey?
It's like everything else. We have this distribution. Well, first of all, I'm starting to counter from 2 years ago. That's important because most of my career preceded that point. And if you asked me what my observations were, was that nobody was paying attention and nobody was taking action. I mean, they're obviously the biggest companies in this country are focused on this issue, right? They expect that, they're publicly traded. They have a long reputation they have investors who are pushing them. They have a reputation in the marketplace and so on. So I feel the biggest companies really are focused on these issues, especially in financial services. But so there's a great variability by industry that I see. And then I see in some industries, for example, in technology, where there is a great deal of sincere interest in doing something about these issues, but only a few that are making the kind of progress that are necessary, because they're unlike financial services where you can criticize financial services, and I criticize financial services sometimes, but what financial services has as an advantage is very process-oriented, very systemic, the way that organizations are structured. So when the CEO or chairman says this is what we're going to do, they have a way of cascading that stuff down through the hierarchy, and it will happen. But if you take a smaller, younger technology company with less of that process orientation and more of the freewheeling model, which offers advantages, by the way, but also maybe not having a history of having recruited most of the technology stars from certain universities and certain companies, and very insular, which is sort of contradictory to innovation, but in reality, I think that's one of the reasons it's harder for these companies to make the changes. It's the reason why in technology companies, I still hear about a lot of concerns about gender representation and inclusion. Of course, I hear a lot of concerns about race and ethnicity. I'm hearing a lot of concerns about just a very specific issue having to do with the caste system and how its effects are being felt in technology companies where they've hired a lot of people from Asia. So there's progress being made. There's progress being made in different industries. There's progress being made in different size organizations. But generally, you see the headlines. It's been 2 years since George Floyd died. How come you don't have more representation in the C-suite or on the board or in the leadership roles? It's because it's going to take time. And some companies are not making it a priority. And, to be honest, Mike, right now we are in a period where there's a little bit of a backlash. There's a bit of a backlash against all this talk about diversity and inclusion, not just there's a bit of a backlash in the general society, but there's also a very specific kind. I live in Florida. I work at a Florida office, and in the state of Florida, we have a new law that was passed July 1st that really House Bill 7 that's really talking about encouraging employees to resist efforts and to teach them about diversity and inclusion. And very specifically says that you can't make diversity and inclusion training mandatory because it's an effort to teach Caucasians that they're guilty of something. And there's all this critical race theory stuff that's thrown in there. The reason I'm mentioning this, Mike, is because I think about these things every day and I think they're great, but I don't think everybody shares my point of view on this, right? So we mustn't separate the fact that I assume 50% of the people who lead companies, 50% of my colleagues, 50% of people in the grocery store think that what I'm talking about is insanity. So there's a bit of a backlash. And I think this is not an easy path to travel.
And I think that's what leads to your observation that to lead inclusion, it has to be led from the top of the organization. Is that right? Is that?
Absolutely. Because frankly, well, I talked a little earlier about how not all members of a senior team will be on board and what you ought to do about that if they're not. Of course, if you don't set that as an expectation, there's no reason why they should do anything differently. But even further in the organization, it's my immediate manager that determines my experience on a day-to-day basis. You know that from your work, right? And the reality is that many of our managers and organizations are not very effective in general. But when you layer on something like, or when you think about something as diversity and inclusion as a separate thing and expect them to be adept at these new expectations that really only started 2 years ago, but you don't sort of teach them or explain to them or show them how to do that, there's absolutely every reason to think that all of these efforts will be for naught. The other thing that I see being overused as a potential solution is implicit bias training. And so when somebody says, oh, we're going to do implicit bias training, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not going to solve anything. And it's not going to solve for what is this manager doing when they're making decisions about who gets hired, who gets laid off, who gets promoted, who gets the opportunities. So my recommendation for all of this, Mike, is that we stop. I say diversity and inclusion is not real. Let's stop thinking of it as a separate entity in a box over here and integrate it into our behavioral expectations for managers and leaders. It's just like how you have to know some math and some science and some marketing and some whatever. You got to know that people vary and that human variation is normal. And then manage 100% of your team, and, so everybody gets the benefits.
Leading inclusion isn't something that's done on the side.
No, it can't be.
Central.
It cannot be.
It's been fascinating for me to be with Dr. Gena Cox, and I'm sure for our listeners as well, and to hear her comments and her observations and her insights on building inclusive organizations from the top down. I think this message that Dr. Gena Cox delivers around that humans vary and that variation is normal, it's so healthy for us as a way of thinking, and how we still need to build true inclusion in workplaces and the enormous work that's ahead of us. Gena Cox, if our audience wanted to get in touch with you or learn more about leading inclusion, how would they get in touch with you, or how would they find out more?
Yeah, they can go to my website, which is my name, GenaCox.com. And if they want to know about the book, they can also just put the word book after my name with a slash, GenaCox.com/book, or GenaCox.com/tip sheet if they want to get a piece of a resource that I have created for anyone who wants some quick ideas about inclusion in their organization.
Great. So one main point to get in touch with Dr. Gena Cox is GenaCox.com, GenaCox.com. And if you want some specific information about leading inclusion, it's the same, GenaCox.com/book, or for some free resources, some additional resources on leading inclusion, GenaCox.com/tip sheet. It's such an important and necessary topic in order to help us live out humanistic values, to have people bring their best to the workplace, so that we're not really just building great places to work, but we're building places where people do their best. And that requires not only a recognition of inclusion, but it requires a commitment in the community to make that happen. And it's so great that we have a leading voice on this in Dr. Gena Cox and her book, Leading Inclusion. So I would encourage everyone again to learn more about her work and what she is doing at genacox.com. Gena, once again, thank you so much for being a guest on the Authentic Change podcast. Any last comments for our audience?
Well, thank you, Mike. The one thing that I try to convey is the optimism that I personally feel, which is to say that I feel these things can all be solved and made better. And, I'm talking to senior leaders, not because I'm trying to put them on the spot, but because I really believe that if we don't do some of the things that I'm talking about, that we will just we'll be having the same conversation 2 years from now. We'll still be frustrated. We've got to just make this feel a little more natural and not like a burden. And we can do that.
It's a great bookend to where we began, and also a great thread is that essence of optimism. So thank you so much, Dr. Gena Cox. Folks, please, for additional information, genacox.com, genacox.com. It's been a great privilege and an honor to discuss, to be in conversation today with Gena Cox and to learn more about her work on leading inclusion. Once again, until the next episode of Authentic Change, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horne.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horne.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast.